All right, hello everybody. Okay, so let me show you kind of what I'm doing here. So I mentioned, we got two versions of the stream going here. Let's chill on that a little bit. So I mentioned on Twitter for anyone who didn't see there that what I want to do today is I want to work on extracting the CSS as the sort of base CSS library or framework that I've been using in KiteTail out of KiteTail into something more reusable, because I'm working on turning it into like an open source CSS framework that other people can use. So I've already done that a little bit, but not in KiteTail yet. But me and Jonathan Renink, who you might know on Twitter, have been sort of hacking on this in a separate repo. And I want to work on pulling that repo. So here's the repo that we have so far. We're calling it a Tailwind CSS, which I think is kind of a cool name. You know, plays in with the KiteTail thing a little bit, which is sort of cool. So we have a repo for that already. And I experimented by pulling that into my Laracon demo app, this cast hacker thing, and using that as like a test bed for extracting it. So I think we've sort of got it in a decent place right now. And now I want to work on trying to apply the same sort of extraction to KiteTail and figure out what the hell breaks when we do it. So let's figure out where to get started. So let's get some stuff set up in the terminal here so we can actually work on it a little bit. I'm going to, let's see here. Let's leave this as it is for now, because there's some work in progress here that I want to make use of eventually. But the way we're going to set this up, it shouldn't really matter that there's unsaved changes there. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and cloned down Tailwind from my GitHub repo to a separate project folder in my code folder. And I use this command called yarn link. And what that does is it globally registers with yarn. This works with npm2, saying that use this local folder as sort of a local version of this library. And it's just used for like local development and debugging. So when I do this, whenever I install this dependency inside of another project, I can use the yarn link command there as well to replace the cloned version in node modules with my local version. So it took me a while to kind of get this figured out, but we'll get there. So I've got a new branch here on KiteTail called extract Tailwind, and that's where we're going to be working from. So first things first, let's head over to our package.json file, and I'm going to rip out normalize and suit, because those are dependencies of Tailwind now. So I'm going to do that, and let's rf node modules, because you never really know, and remove yarn.lock. And I'm trying to remember what the command is to add it from a local. We have to add the local file path and then replace it with a link. So I think we want to do something like yarn add file ... / tailwind CSS. Okay. And if we hang out for a little bit here and let this install, it should hopefully work. Thankfully, yarn is a lot faster than the old npm used to be, so having to do this live on the stream isn't the worst thing to ever have to sit through. All right, so let's see where that got us. So now we have Tailwind CSS pulled in as like a local dependency. And if we head over to our node modules folder and scroll way down, we should see that it has, in fact, copied that in. So this is not a symlink right now. This is a copy. So now, if we go back to the terminal, go back to the terminal and we run yarn link Tailwind CSS here, that's saying in this current project, use the linked version of Tailwind CSS instead of the one that we installed. It's sort of weird. You have to install it first But thankfully, there's this local file option that lets me install a dependency without publishing it to the npm repository or anything. Okay. So this is now saying that we're going to use the linked version. So if we look here and we open this with Finder, yeah, you can see that this resolved to the symlink. So now if we go up to like the node modules folder and open that in Finder and scroll way down, you should see that Tailwind has a little bit of a different icon because it is a symlink. So now we're symlinked in, so that's cool. So that means that if I need to make changes to Tailwind, which is really common at this stage as we're sort of working on it at the same time as, trying to figure out what needs to change there to better support being used as a library. It means it's really easy for me to just like switch over to the Tailwind stuff here, change this inline, make commits, push it up and stuff, and have everything get updated right away, which is cool. Okay, so the next step is to look at my app.less file and figure out what we can get rid of. So when we first extracted it, Tailwind was literally this whole folder. And we're realizing there's a lot of stuff that we don't want to put in the library or framework just yet. Some stuff that's maybe a little bit too opinionated on design and stuff like that. So we've simplified it so far to just the reset. And this is sort of a hacky thing that I had to do because when you use this link thing, the dependencies can be in different folders depending on whether you've cloned it down properly or whether you're using a symlink. And I can't figure out a way to tell it to use relative paths the way I want. So we have to make them both optional and just hope that one of them exists, which sucks, but whatever. I'll figure that out eventually. It's good enough for local dev. But anyways, we have the reset that pulls in normalize and suit CSS base. Suit CSS base is cool. It's a really, really light layer on top of normalize that just does some things like setting up the box sizing properly, removes a bunch of extraneous padding from things and margin. It calls itself like a better starting point for web applications. So when you're building like a blog or something, things like H1s and stuff and P tags, you often do want to have like some natural margin in there so things just kind of work. But when you're building like a user interface, most of the time you just end up trying to undo these and they sort of get in the way. So this adds a little bit of extra reset on some things. Nothing crazy like some of the old CSS resets you've seen, but something just a little bit lighter. So it's kind of helpful. So we pull in normalize and suit. And then I have a couple other reset related stuff, and we're still kind of trying to decide how much of this to put in here and how much to not put in here. So we'll get there. But besides the reset file, all we have is this utilities file. And this imports colors, which eventually might get a different name, but so far we're just putting some color variables in there, and then imports kind of all my utility stuff. So we're not putting any components in this framework yet, just focusing on utilities, get all that stuff working. And then I think we're going to create sort of like a starting point theme that has some components sort of composed out of these utilities. So maybe like some default button and form styles and stuff like that. But for now, just extracting the utilities themselves, kind of like building blocks of the whole thing. So these three files. Actually, we don't even need to import colors. We need to import the reset and the utilities. And those are going to be how we kind of get started in the KiteTail repo now. So I'm going to go over to Cast Hacker repo because I've already done this here. So we get the right number of directory traversal stuff going on. So import that reset instead. I'm going to comment on all these components, and we'll just see what breaks. I know I'm going to need this, so we'll keep that in there. And then for the utilities, we'll pull in the parent sort of utilities file from Tailwind. And we'll comment out all of these, although we might need some of them. I can't remember if we're including the view helpers in here. We are right now, but again, things are kind of like in flux right now. And then the animations and transitions, we decided to remove those from the other framework as well and just keep them like per project, so those will stay. So let's just run this and see how much stuff breaks, because stuff will definitely break. Okay, so it did compile, but things are probably going to look bad. Yeah, so we're missing a bunch of stuff, of course, right? Which is no big deal. We'll sort this out. This isn't looking as good as it used to. Okay, so for sure, we're going to need to pull forms back in. So that should clean up some of this stuff. Doesn't look like it's... Okay, so forms depend on buttons. So let's pull in buttons first and forms second. Button primary text color is undefined. Okay, so one other thing that we're missing is I have my own colors file here for KiteTail. So let's pull that in, although we're going to want to kind of clean that up a little bit eventually too. So we'll do that right at the end. The nice thing about less, the order of variable declarations doesn't matter. It does matter in the sense that the very last defined variable is the one that gets used for the entire file. So we don't have to like carefully figure out, okay, we got to make sure we import it before here or whatever, like you do with SAS. We just stick it right at the end. Yeah, form could import buttons, maybe. I don't know. I think it makes it kind of awkward in some ways, because then like all I have to import in my main one is forms, and then I don't see that I'm also getting buttons. I don't really mind this sort of like, I guess, you know, subtle dependency that isn't really obvious when it comes to this stuff. I don't mind it. So let's just keep working and we'll see where we get. Okay, so we got a button showing up here, which is looking pretty good. So in our orders section, now all our link styles are messed up. The select thing is messed up. We do have a button here now, so we're getting closer. So let's pull in forms next. And now we got that form control working, which is pretty nice. If we head over here, this form is looking a little bit better. This card looks messed up. So we are using my card component here, although I don't think we really need it, but let's pull it in anyways. So let's head over to the card. And you can see these are really simple. Now this is depending on the variables defined in the padding and spacing helpers. So we probably don't want to necessarily leak that information out. I think this should probably be defined more like .py5 and .px6. So spacer 5 in the vertical direction and 6 in the horizontal direction, which is what we have here. I had to switch to this parametric mix-in style because of some weird things that happen with less when you try to mix in generated classes that end in 0. Really weird bug. But we'll get there. Okay, so we do have a card now. All right, so that's getting closer. Now, something is obviously messed up here. I think what this is my icon styles. So let's head over to, and you can see that up here too. These icons are messed up. So let's go over to app.ls and we'll import icons. All right, so we got icons. Those are looking okay. This is looking better now. Links are messed up. So me and Jonathan decided, I used to, if you look in my utilities links.ls file, I was setting some default styling for all links or anything with the .link utility class. We decided that for the framework, it probably didn't make sense to automatically style everybody's links in a certain way. We also aren't even including the link component in the final framework yet. So right now I have link as like a utility, right? So this is like an interesting sort of discussion that might be worth explaining because it's a thought process that we've sort of been going through. But I've been calling links utilities up to this point. But we sort of decided that a link is actually more of a component than it is a utility, because the job of these link classes really, it's not as apparent when you look at them, but what they're doing is composing other utilities. So this thing that's like setting the color of the text to text brand, in reality, this should be able to get replaced with just like a text brand utility. And down here where we're darkening it by 15%, I think I've decided that I don't love using these less helpers in my components, because if you're not careful, doing things like this can really bloat the number of colors in your application. You might think like, okay, we have this base color and we want it a little bit darker, so let's darken it by 15%. But if in this file I darken it by 15%, somewhere else I darken it by 25, somewhere else I darken it by 20, all of a sudden we have way too many variations of that. I think it's better to predefine what the dark color should be. So ultimately what I'd like to be able to do here is have this be like text brand dark or something, and have that be a utility that we can mix in. And then you can see that really link brand is just like a component that's composing two more traditional, like statically applied utilities and sort of explaining how they should interact with each other. So on hover and focus, we should be using this one, and not, we should be using this. So it started to become clear to us that links are more like components than they are utilities, because they're sort of combining other utilities. And you just sort of apply it to simplify how you'd otherwise construct a link out of bare utilities. So that means that in our app.less file, here where I was including utilities links, I'm going to take that and move it to my own components directory, and then move this up here and pull that in as components links. And that should get things a little bit closer in here. So now we've got like our links back. So this is already like looking pretty good at this point. Everything is kind of looking right here. So there's not really anything missing here. If we go to the checkout page, how's that looking? It's looking pretty good. And I can never remember if I've got everything set up for being able to actually demo this checkout process. So let's just see what happens. Yeah, and this looks right too. Okay, cool. So our extraction has been like pretty effective. So one thing that's worth noticing at this point is we got a bunch of commented out components, which means we're not using these. We also moved the grid from being a component to a utility. That one was kind of a trickier decision because it's sort of a component, but it made more sense to ship it with the whole framework. And since we had no components yet, then we decided to move it to utilities. But anyways, I got all these components that I'm not using yet, and all these utilities that I'm not using at all, right? And everything still seems to be working. So we're not importing any custom utilities right now. So let's just delete this entire utilities directory and delete all these. The Stripe stuff is good, and I think that's the only third-party library thing I have. And now all these components that we're not using should be able to get deleted too, right? So like alerts are not getting used because most of the time I just do this with utilities. When we make some more like component packs or themes and stuff to like layer on top of like the base utility framework, I think we'll definitely have things like alerts. What was I doing with the text? Was it like this stuff where I was moving it up and down? If that's what I was doing, in Sublime, it's Control, Command, up or down while you're on a certain line. So anyways, we do want to like create like layers of components that are like higher level abstractions that we can bake into some sort of more themier things, because they tend to have some more design decisions baked into them, like more aesthetic. So we want to kind of keep that as a separate layer. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and basically delete anything I'm not using here. So drop down, actually, let's check that. I'm pretty sure drop down is going to be broken right now. So that'll be this thing. Yep, this is totally broken. Okay, good thing we caught that. So let's pull in this drop down component and check on that one. Okay, so that's good. And one other thing I actually want to check on is this horizontal rule. Okay, so I need that too. So horizontal rules. Is everything else here okay? Yeah. So then we get this little nice little short horizontal rule, whatever. So that's cool. Okay. So that's good now. Unpublished works, published works, all our fancy animations are there. Okay, so drop down we need to keep, forms we need to keep, generated grid, this completely goes away now because that's baked into the framework. The old grid goes away because we're not even using it. Horizontal rules we keep, icons we keep, images goes away because that actually got moved to be a utility in the framework now. And we need to do a lot of work to clean this up because so much of the stuff in here is random, sort of specific to me stuff. So we need to figure out a way to generalize some of that. So images can go. Links we need. Lists. I feel like we'll probably provide this with the framework, but I'm not using any of this right now. So by default, we strip all lists to be plain, so they're more ready to style. But if you ever need to bring back plain old lists, we have like 2 utilities for that, but we can trash that. I have this set of markdown styles, which really this is just for user submitted content, which doesn't happen on this project. But I have some other projects where I'm storing HTML in the database and I want to be able to style it to look nice since I can't put classes in there. So this is kind of just a component that's used to wrap user submitted content so that it has some default styling. Jordan, I'm working on extracting my CSS framework out of KiteTail and sort of replacing the version that's baked into it with a kind of a version of it I've already extracted. And then we're going to kind of work on the CSS framework and KiteTail a little bit at the same time. So we can delete that markdown thing because we're not using it. Media object, again, not using it in this project. Progress bar, not using it in this project. So that means I can delete every component here that we're not using. Okay, so what we end up with is the Tailwind sort of base reset stuff, which still needs some work to really fine tune, but you know it's good enough for now. We end up with like KiteTail specific components. So these are all components that I've built just for this project. We pull in some styles to style the Stripe elements library. So we have no control over the class names that are used there. So I like to extract that out to a separate file. So I'm forced to use their class names. So what can you do? Put that in its own file, so at least it's like nice and encapsulated. Then we pull in all the Tailwind utilities, and it's important that these kind of come towards the end because we want these to be able to trump values that are defined in here. And then I pull in what I'm calling glitter, which is kind of like flashier stuff, animations and transitions. And this is not really totally ironed out yet, but we're keeping it project specific for now. And then I had some color overrides. So some of this we're going to be able to work on simplifying. So if you look at the Tailwind colors file, it's basically going to look exactly the same as my colors file because that's where it came from. But what I'd like to do is make the Tailwind one more general and, you know, have just my specific overrides here. So instead of having 2 copies of the exact same file, just completely rewriting everything, I make it a little bit more organized so it's kind of easier to customize. So the first thing I want to do actually is this stuff is specific to buttons. So instead of putting this into colors, I think what I've decided is I want to move variable definitions to the component when I can and save this colors file or this variables file specifically for things that are overriding Tailwind defined stuff. So forms as well, like Tailwind doesn't provide any forms right now. So I'm going to move those to my own component. And this will depend on some KiteTail variables and stuff, which I think is okay. But we don't want them in this overrides thing. Okay, so things start to get a little bit more interesting here. So there's a lot of stuff in here that is kind of specific to my project, but there still needs to be values in Tailwind. So let's, what does that import thing do where it's like a tilde with no slash? I'm curious to know about that. What I want to do is kind of simultaneously figure out what do I want the Tailwind values to be for colors and how do I want to be able to override them with KiteTail. So the system that we sort of have for text colors, for example, that's cool. Let's try that. Okay, so if I just stick a tilde in front of it with no slash, that's going to go straight to that node modules folder. If this works, I'm going to be so excited. Man, that's so much cleaner. That's awesome. I didn't know that. So something I'm curious about now is, will that work in this file too? So like if I change this to be like tilde, and say I commented out these two, is that going to like magically work? Now I don't know what I'm pulling in from normalize, and let's just comment that out and see like if this looks worse in some way. Oh yeah, busted. Relative to the Webpack config file. So does that mean that if I do this, everyone would have to use Webpack for this to work? Because this is pretty cool, I gotta say. I'm into that. Yeah, so this is working. Yeah, that's cool. I learned something. Thanks for that tip. I dig that. Cool. So what I want to do is explain the color scale in Tailwind a little bit, and also figure out how we're going to customize it. So it looks like in Tailwind itself, I've moved the color variable definitions to here. So we have to like kind of figure out how we want this to work. So getting to it, in Tailwind and KiteTail, I have this concept of light text and dark text. So in a lot of other utility frameworks, you have just like a gray scale that starts from like black to white, and you just pick text colors along the way. I find that doesn't work as well as it sounds like it would, because in practice, I usually want my light text colors to be defined using like opacity of white, so they work on top of colored backgrounds, whereas the dark ones I don't. So instead of having just one scale of colors, I decided that it made more sense to sort of bucket it into like light text and dark text. And light text is meant to be used on darker colored backgrounds, and dark text is meant to be used on lighter backgrounds. So you use dark text when the background is lighter than the text, and you use light text when the background is meant to be darker than the text. And each one sort of has its own set of 4 options. So you can see I have like text light, which is pure white, and then I have a softer, or a soft, a softer, and a softest version, which is basically reducing the contrast, right? That's how I kind of think about softening the text. And then I have dark, which is like as close to black as my text will get, and then softer and softer variation of that, which reduces the contrast. So this color and this color are the closest together in sort of the scale, right? And if you look at the actual UI, you can see kind of like examples of this in different places, probably. I don't know, maybe in like the orders page. So like this is probably like text dark softer. This is probably like text dark soft, you know, and this is text dark. This is probably text dark softest sort of thing. So that's how I'm kind of using it. So I have like kind of a predefined bucket of like different text color options. So you don't end up using like darken 10% and make a million different variations. So I want to figure out in this text.less file, I have the colors defined here, and right now they're just sort of like taking, they're kind of hue based, right? So I use HSL for everything because it's like a more intuitive way to think about color. So with HSL, the first value is sort of like the position on the color wheel. So maybe, you know, that tells you whether it's green or whether it's purple. And S is the saturation, which tells you like how bright the color is, like how vibrant it is versus how like kind of washed out and gray it is. And then the lightness tells you on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 is black and 100 is white. And 50 is like the most vibrant version of that color. So the nice thing about using HSL is we can say we want all our dark text to be based on the same point on the color wheel. In this case, I'm calling it this slate color, which if you look at the color definitions, do I have that in here? It's a hue of 208, which is like a blue. And so now every one of these colors is based on that blue point in the color wheel, but they have like varying amounts of lightness. And you can even like have varying amounts of saturation too if you wanted. Okay, good to know about the tilde import. So I shouldn't use that here. So this thing is still going to be a mess. This shouldn't actually be in the finished version, but I need it there for local dev, but whatever. So what I want to figure out, I guess, is where do I want to get these colors from to start? So it's tricky to sort of figure this out. And part of me wonders if it doesn't really matter for the dark stuff, but like every gray in my system is sort of based on this same hue, right? So if you look at like my background colors, that uses hue slate. The borders, hue slate. The text, hue slate. So that's kind of like my gray sort of color, right? So it's hard to figure out how to define this in terms of being general for everyone, because I like to think about things in terms of hues. But other people might not. And I definitely want like a translation layer between like a color palette and then how that's applied to text. So for example, when I say text dark here, I want this to have its own sort of variable, right? So when I go down to text dark, I want the color to be text dark. I don't like the idea of putting like color gray 7 here. It just like, I don't like having to change that down here. I like to have one central place where I sort of like take what's defined in the color palette, which may be colors that are more named after colors like green, red, grays. Take that definition, use a new variable like text dark soft here, or text dark, to sort of pick the color that I want to use. And then this file should only reference variables defined in this file. You know what I mean? So at the top of the file is where we'll translate existing variables into specific namespaced variables. And then below is where we'll use those namespaced variables. So kind of tricky to decide how I want to pull these colors in. Like hue slate, where that should get defined is it's kind of tricky to think about how to do it, because yeah, I'm not sure. So we'll keep these here anyways because they make sense as overrides. These ones make sense as overrides. So do these. Something that's kind of funky is I have this color scale defined, this gray scale, but I don't actually really use it for anything, which makes me kind of skeptical about whether or not it should exist. The only place I think I use it is in this file. No, maybe actually it's in my buttons file. So I have like color gray 8 and 4. So the button disabled background and the button disabled border. So maybe what we should do is take a look at what gray 8 and gray 4 are, and maybe we can figure out how to not depend on those here. So it's like hue gray, which I think is the same as hue slate, so that needs cleaning up. And we got 25 and 96. So if we look at like our background colors down here, I mean, it's pretty similar to the BG light softer color. So I'd have to figure out if I wanted to reuse that or not. But because it's a button, it's a little bit trickier to decide. Yeah, some interesting decisions to make here. So you know what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to leave some of this stuff as is for now, because I think I'm going to want to collaborate on some of this with Jonathan to figure out. But there's certain things that I wanted to extract more out of Tailwind that shouldn't be in there anymore, that are color related. So one of those things, for example, is I have a bunch of greens in here that you can see, like this button. The button is not so big of a deal because the buttons are my own components, but this border, for example, or even probably there's some places where I have like green text, are places where I want to remove that color knowledge from Tailwind. So I was playing around with some crazy stuff here related to generating utilities from this like map of stuff. And I think I'd like to do that here as well. So if you look at app less, I have none of my own utilities, right? I'm only using Tailwind utilities. If you look at the Tailwind utility backgrounds, there's this BG primary. And there's also some borders for this too. So what I would like to do is figure out how to not have this at all inside of Tailwind for now. I want Tailwind to start being focused on really generic stuff that works for everybody. So like basically every app has this concept of some light backgrounds and some dark backgrounds, but not every app has the same number of like colored backgrounds, and not every app wants to call them the same thing, right? So here's like a example. I was looking at Shopify's Polaris design system, and here is their sort of color palette. So these are all the colors that Shopify uses throughout their whole product. And each color has like a name, like say sky, and variations. So that has light, lighter, or dark. Ink only has lighter variations. You know, title bar has 2 darker variations and 1 light variation. A lot of these colors, they just call the plain old name, like purple, blue, yellow. And if you look at like a CSS framework like Tachyons, for example, and look at the docs for this, they do the same sort of thing. And a lot of people have like a sort of negative gut reaction to this. Like people don't like it when they see a class like BG light pink, because you've sort of been trained to not want visual information in your HTML. And I can get on board with this in some ways. Like to me, it'd be better if you could come up with some sort of less coupled name for it. Not to be semantic for semantics sake, but only really to sort of like defend yourself against changes. You know, if you decide that like light pink all of a sudden shouldn't be so light anymore, now the name is wrong, and that sort of sucks. So I personally like to pick names that I think are more resistant to subtle changes. So what I'd like to do with Tailwind is give people sort of the defaults out of the box that everyone sort of needs. So like here's like a white background, right, which might be your light background. Here's like a softer light background. Like almost every app has like light grays and whites, or dark grays for like maybe a footer is supposed to be black with white text. Like that's super common, so I feel comfortable generalizing that. But when it comes to picking colors and having utilities built out of those colors, and also naming those colors, I don't really feel comfortable prescribing to people how they should do that. Some people might want to do it like Tachyons, where they say, okay, well, we have a green that our product uses, and I want to be able to say BG green, right? So I want people to be able to do that. But I also want other people to be able to say, well, I want to call it BG brand and BG secondary. You know, I want people to have that flexibility, and I want to make that easy for people to generate those. So what I was working on was basically some mix-ins, like these generator mix-ins, that let you sort of generate new batches of utilities with variant names, right? So I was using Shopify as inspiration here. So take a look at like Indigo has lighter, light, and then they call this primary. If you look on the page, they say use any primary background color with white text. So when it's not a variant, this is just the primary version of that. Then they have dark and darker. Hey, Dominic, I am working on some CSS framework stuff. So extracting some stuff from KiteTail and trying to make it more generalizable for people. And also working on taking some of the stuff that's in the framework that's still too specific to KiteTail and exposing ways to make that easy for me to generate in my app. So that's kind of what we're talking about now. So I was using these naming schemes as inspirations anyways, allowing people to basically say, okay, well, here's the name of the suite of utilities that I want to generate, right? So using the Shopify example, this one's indigo. Here's the variations that I have. So we have lighter, light, primary, dark, and darker, right? Which is these 5, whereas this one is primary. And then these are the values for each one, right? So this is like a key value pair. And then I have utilities like this generate backgrounds utility, where I can pass in a name and then pass in the colors. So if you look at these like side by side, you can see when I call this, what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, I want to make some backgrounds in like the indigo namespace. And here's a map of my variants and the corresponding colors. Yep, I'm going to release it open source when it's ready to be open sourced. But it is something I really want to do because I've been sort of hacking on it for like almost 3 years now in various forms and copying and pasting it from project to project and kind of getting sick of doing that. So I'm trying to make something a little bit more formalized and reusable for everyone. So anyways, I've got this generator that does some really fancy recursive pattern matching stuff to work. But what it lets me do, and you can see this if I move this down here, is it lets me call this with a namespace name and a map of colors. And then over here in public app CSS, if we search for indigo, you can see it generated all these helpers for me, right? So we get the lighter through darker indigo ones. And the primary one gets no suffix, and I'm using some pattern matching stuff to do that. So when it's the primary variant, we don't include the suffix. But when it's not the primary variant, then we do include the variant name as the suffix. So it's kind of neat. So the nice thing about this is it's really flexible in the sense that if someone wants to make like their own backgrounds, like here's an example that I was showing to Taylor earlier, you can just say, well, here's the name that I want, and here's like the map of colors. And you can just do this on the fly, and it doesn't matter how many you have, right? Like you can have as many variations as you want. Like I could call this the foo variation and this the bar variation. It doesn't have to be light and dark. Now if we scroll down here, we get palm tree foo and palm tree bar. So you can kind of come up with your own naming convention and your own design system, and everything will sort of work. You can have 100 variations here and it won't matter. If you only have one variation, it won't work super well. So that's something that I need to figure out with some pattern matching to solve, but we'll get there. Yeah, so what I'd like to do is replace some of the primary based stuff in KiteTail with generated versions of that. So let's head over to app.less and we'll do it inline here to start. So I'm going to take what I created here, this fancy mix-in madness, and we'll cut that out because that shouldn't be in this colors.less file. And instead we'll paste this into the backgrounds file, and I'm going to stick it at the top for now. So let's delete everything except for the actual generators. So we got 2 generators for stripping out the primary suffix and keeping it. And even this might want to generalize, but I feel okay prescribing that like for the primary one, you should just use primary. Although we could do something like instead of primary, you could do none, or we could explicitly say like don't have a name. You know, that's like another way to do it. Or you might even like do an empty string, you know, but whatever. I'll figure that out. So we'll start with this. And we'll have this mix in, and then generate backgrounds for a color name passing through color variants. Okay. So let's cut this example where we use it. Cut all this out. Then over here, we'll paste in the ability to generate our primary backgrounds. So I'm going to copy this for now and paste it in so we can use it as like a reference. So we've got BG primary, which looks like it's getting defined as color brand primary. And if we head over to colors.less, I do have color brand primary defined here. So let's just copy color brand primary and paste that in here too. And we'll probably move this to be defined somewhere else to start, but just working on trying to make it so this framework doesn't need to care about, first of all, it doesn't even need to care about the word brand or the word primary or what the color even is. Okay, so here's kind of our values, right? We got this one, and this one. And we're calling them BG primary soft and BG primary dark. And if I'm being honest, I don't even know if I use these anywhere. So let's look at, like, is BG primary soft? Okay, that gets used in this style guide file that I never used for anything. BG primary dark also gets used in the style guide, and that's it. So it, like, barely needs to exist. Same with BG primary. It completely doesn't need to exist. So that's kind of annoying. We could just not even do this work, but I think it's more interesting to do it and see how it works. So our map, so our accent name is going to be primary, right? Because those are the backgrounds that we want to generate. That's the color name. So again, if we go and look at the background mix-in, we can see that it accepts a color name and variants, and then optionally, this is just used for recursion. You should never pass this in yourself. So we need to pass through a map now. So our map is going to have a few values, and I haven't figured out a way to format this in a way that I like, but maybe this will be okay. So we're going to have soft, which is going to be this value. And we're going to have primary, which is just going to be BG primary. And then we're going to have dark, which is going to be the darkened version of that. And now BG primary, we should define here for now as the same as color brand primary. Okay, so if we were to get rid of that, we should be able to look at, assuming everything's compiling, public app CSS and look for BG primary. And it looks like, are we getting them? Let's go over to our utilities file here and not generate these ones. And also not generate the responsive versions. And just make sure that we're still getting them showing up here. Yeah, so now you can see that we are getting those values. And I wonder why this has an RGBA. Oh, it's because we used a fade on it. I think it should be dark and light, like Rainwater is saying there, instead of soft. I like to prefer using soft for different use cases, but I wanted to work on making it identical to start. Okay, so that's pretty cool. I would like to be able to generate the responsive versions as well, but let's save that for another time, because I think that's going to have to, I don't know, I think we have to do something to generate like responsive backgrounds or something like a variation on the mix-in to do that. So that's kind of neat that worked. So let's try it for something that we actually are using, so we can make sure that it works the way we want. An example of that would be like this underline, I think. So here we got border brand, okay? So let's work on a generator for borders too. So I'm going to start by copying the backgrounds generator, because I think this is going to be the same sort of approach. And we'll head over to borders.less, and I'll paste these generators up here. So let's call this generate border color utility. And generate border colors. Seems okay. Generate border color utility. Generate border colors. So I think the syntax is going to be the same, except here, of course, instead of being BG, it looks like we just want border dash. So border dash border dash, and this won't be background color. I think it's just as simple as doing border color. Now, actually, this one is interesting too, because we probably want to generate... Do we need to generate the directions for all of them? We'll leave that for later, but we might need to generate variations based on the position. Ooh, funky stuff. Generating CSS can be an interesting challenge. Okay, so this all needs to get organized better eventually, but we'll get there. So let's find the border brand helper. So right now this is only getting one thing generated. So that actually is going to present like sort of an interesting problem for us, because we'll have to solve some stuff. So let's copy this definition and put that out here too. And eventually what I'm probably going to do is have my own backgrounds and borders files specifically for my project where I generate them. So we'll have a border brand get set here. And then what we want to do is we want to call this generate border colors mixin, passing through the name of the border, which in this case is brand. So there's already some inconsistencies. Like I call it primary for backgrounds, but brand for borders. It's all really stupid. And then we need a list of lists. But because we only have one border that we want to generate, it's going to be tricky. So let's start by generating 2, and then we'll work on the sort of mix in guards that we need to make it work for 1. So if we have a primary one, which would be border brand, let's also have like a dark one where we just darken border brand by like 20%, even though we're not using this, because this should at least work, and then we can kind of see the result. So yeah, it seems like it's working. So if we head over here now, we should hopefully have border brand and border brand dark. Yeah, so that's promising. So if we head over to borders now, do we have brand inside the responsive ones? Where does it appear? So let's delete this definition and also delete this version so that we don't bake in color choices into the framework. And then we still have them here. So cool, that's looking good. So let's figure out a way that we could make this work by only passing through 1. So the problem right now is the way that nested lists work in less is they're almost a feature by coincidence because of the fact that less supports multiple types of delimiters. So this is most easy to see if we still had that list here. So I'll copy this for a second, and paste it into this other file so I can sort of explain how it works. So this here is a list, right? Where this is an item in a list, this is an item in a list, this is an item in a list, you know, and so on and so forth. So in less, when you use this function that's built in called extract, I'll start simpler. If we call the length function on this list, we're going to get a result of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The length of this list is 5 items. If we call extract, we can pass a position in that list to return. So if I called, say we just called this, we'll just call this variance. And maybe we can go to like the less browser thing. Try less browser. I can kind of demo it. Okay. So say we did variant is extract from variance position 3. Why is this complaining? Could not parse call arguments or missing blah on line 8. Let's just see what happens. Maybe it's broken in other ways. Extract variance 3. Does this need to be a comma? Okay. So the extract function needs a comma, although it does seem to work here with a semicolon. So what extract will do is, let's just call this result. So it kind of looks like we're looking at code, even though it's CSS. So this will extract the third item from there, right? But the thing is, less also lets me work on lists of spaces. So say I got rid of all these commas. Now the third item in this list is actually 1, 2, 3. So light is the third item, which is why we're just getting light. So less supports nested lists using this syntax where whatever I extract from this list, in this case position 3, which is this, gives me something else, which is its own list that I can extract stuff from. So here I could say like name is extract from the variant item 1, and the color is extract from the variant item 2. And then here I can say the name, is the name, and the color is the color. So that's how we get the values out of this like nested lists. So because of the fact that lists in less work like just nested in this way where there's no real way to differentiate between spaces or commas, it means that if I just pass in one item here, things are going to break because this mixin is expecting to get a list of lists, but it's just getting a list where each item is just one. You know what I mean? So what we need to do is in this generate border colors mixin, we need to figure out a way to act differently if the length of color variance is 2. And actually that's not even true either, because if it's length 2, they could still be 2 different items. So it's solvable. It's solvable. I think what we need to do is we need to extract the variant and pass in the variant to another mixin and count the number of arguments present and react differently. So when we extract this variant in this first case, right, we might come back with like just 1. So here's a question. If we do something like length, hello, okay, that comes back as 1, 2, 2. That's still 2, eh? That's weird. I would expect that to be something else. So if we do length of blah, 5. So something weird about using literal values versus variables. So that's already good to know. So if we extract item 1 from the color variance list, and item 1 is only a length of 1 instead of a length of 2, then we basically need to call this right away instead. So it's almost like what we need to do is take this stuff, cut that out, and then call something else here, like generate border color utilities. It sucks coming up with names for these sometimes, but basically we want to pass through the color name, the variant, which is extracted now, so instead of being color variance, and I guess man, confusing. Recursive stuff is complicated. Generate border color utilities. So this will take the color name, the variant, and then And we need two versions of this. So we need when length of variant is equal to 1. And then when length of variant is equal to 2. Okay, so when it's equal to 2, this is what we want to do. And this actually sucks because we have to pass through the color variance again. So it looks like we're going to have to pass that through all the way. So we'll make sure that we accept that here. Ooh, man, this is getting spooky. This will be the last thing that we do today because my brain is starting to fall apart. And yeah, and that makes sense, I guess. It's kind of messed up. I can probably figure out a way to simplify this. And when it's just 1, then what we actually need to do is use the entire color variance. So this will actually be color variance instead of variant. So once we can look at this, we might be able to figure out a way to simplify it. And then we can generate a border color utility for that. And then we don't have to recursively call back in because there's nothing else to call. Or maybe we should actually. Because then maybe we can do some interesting things in other ways. I don't know. Let's just see what this generates. Things are going to break, I think. Can't use Sass because Sass doesn't support any of the useful features that I need for this framework to work. Sass is terrible. Maybe the worst thing ever made. Okay, so we got two versions of it getting generated, which is kind of odd. So let's try and think why two versions of that would get made. I considered using post CSS, but I couldn't find any examples of it doing the things I needed it to do, and it made me wonder if it was possible or not, so I didn't go down that rabbit hole too far. So something is causing this to get generated twice. So we call generate border colors, we pass through a name, and we pass through a list that happens to be two things. So we pass through the color variance in this case. When I is less than or equal to the length of color variance. Okay, so that's an interesting, I think that's actually the problem. So in this case, color variance has a length of 2 when it should just be like a length of 1 because there's only one item there. So it's almost like in this case where the length of the variant is 1. Instead of doing I plus 1, it's almost like we actually have to do I plus 2, which actually makes me think that like something else is wrong, or I can't do the thing that I was kind of thinking I could do. So I was kind of hoping that like by recursively calling this again here, that it would kind of like make it easier for us to support like this sort of thing. But I'm realizing that that's not actually even the same thing. So if we just don't call it recursively, then I think that'll just give us 1. And we still get the, let's try generating a brand one. Let's try generating like a foobar one that has like a light, which will just make white. A primary, which will make like 666. And then a dark, which will make 0. Just so we can sort of prove that both paths of this are kind of working as expected. So we get brand, we get foobar, light, foobar, and dark. So that is still working as expected. So now I'm thinking like, what can we do to simplify this? So we're passing in a list with just 2 items in it instead of a full list, which sucks, but it is what it is. We have to extract the current variant, which is what we're doing to extract these two things. Well, actually what we're doing is we're just extracting the first one. And then we're trying to say, generate them again, passing through like what we extracted as the current variant, just so we can pattern match against that variant and make sure that there was 2 items there. And if there's 2 items there, then we want to extract the name and the color from that variant, generate that border color utility, and move on to the next item in the list. But if there's only 1 item there, then we want to basically discard it and instead treat the color variants like the whole list that was passed in to generate the whole 2 things, and then don't call it recursively. I can't think of a use case that would break this, honestly. Weird things would happen if you did something like this, I'm sure. Like this will probably break. Or just will have interesting things happen. Yeah, like this. So somehow light got used for both of them. Which is pretty funky, of course. But that's probably user error that we can rely on people not doing. But it would be nice to be able to come up with like better names for these mix-ins. It's hard for people to know that like this is the one they're supposed to call and that they're not supposed to call this one. But this is a way to work around that issue of being able to support people just trying to generate one or people trying to generate multiple. Now, if they did want to generate one, the other option would be to tell them to just call this function instead, right? But it sucks to have to use a different mix-in just because your list only has 1 item in it. So I think it is worth doing this song and dance. But yeah, anyways, this has been a long one, like 1 hour and 15 minutes, longer than usual. But hopefully it's been kind of interesting, seeing some of the thought process behind what I'm trying to do with some of this stuff. And yeah, wish me luck as I continue going down this path of trying to make things customizable without making the maintenance burden of the actual framework total hell. So thanks for checking out the stream and listening along and following along. And hopefully I'll catch you on Friday at the next one if you're around. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.